I am with Teads, yes.
Okay, good, good. Okay, so we got that part right. Anyway, guys, I'm gonna fade off into the background here. You guys have a good chat. See you soon.
Thanks, Alan.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. How are you doing, Brian?
Well, how are you doing, Kari?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I am excited to be talking to you today and hosting this fireside chat. And I know I thank Brand Innovators for having us both. I am a last minute change. Matt Doherty, my colleague on the East Coast, was going to be here, but it's you and I'm very excited to chat with you. And I'm excited to chat with you about a lot of the things that are going on in the industry. And where I would love to start, though, is can you just give us a little bit about you, your background, how things have been the past year?
Yeah, absolutely. Kari, thanks for the setup. So yeah, I mean, I'll kind of start maybe with the boring bio stuff, and then we can talk about what's been going on the past year or so. So I've actually been with the organization for a little over 10 years now, well before it became Inspire. We became Inspire 3 years ago in February. So that said, started with the Arby's brand, and as the portfolio has grown over time, including as of December of last year, we've now effectively become a portfolio of 7 brands. So Arby's, Buffalo Wild Wings, Baskin Robbins, Dunkin', Jimmy John's, Sonic, and Rusty Taco. But that's a little bit of what I do. As an agency guy before that for much of my career, and spent a couple of years at Coca-Cola as well. So agency, client side, and kind of everything in between.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just, and just, I mean, this past year, I think you kind of incorporated that too. Looking back, I'll tell you, and I was thinking about this morning as sort of a setup to this conversation. A year ago, a little over a year ago, actually, it was obviously for everybody, not just us, but a very, very different climate. One of which, frankly, I would not have prognosticated the performance that we saw rounding out the year, and frankly, the performance that persists. Some of which is definitely aided by some tailwinds rather. Economic stimulus, certainly being one, the proliferation of vaccines and therefore the ability for, across the country, restaurants to reopen, for in-restaurant dining where applicable, bearing in mind, state and municipal regulations, but nonetheless, really key point there is, a very different outcome than what I was thinking we would have seen this time last year.
When everything happened, and everybody kind of shut down, what were your first, what did you think? What did you anticipate was going to be the year for you, given you are in the restaurant business?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the very first thing will acknowledge is, as an organization, we are directly linked to operations and what's happening at the customer facing end. So meaning, the restaurant touch points. So that said, it really was sort of a calibration of what needed to be done, including CDC compliance to say, are we shuttering and for how long? Also acknowledging that, is sort of a first line necessary services, if you will, restaurant categories applied to that. So for us, as it relates to marketing and specifically media, what did we need to do, right? So a quick assessment of the landscape to do a few things. For example, looking at our upfront video investments, what message were we going to run? And typically something that was pre-planned months in advance, pre-produced, is not necessarily indigenous to the environment, right? So it was a quick assessment of do we need to change the message, which we did, which, again, if we all kind of recall to the state of how things were, it really became, sort of a beacon to say to consumers that were seeking means for dining occasions to say we're open, right? Kind of the basic messages. And then as the situation sort of played out into April and May, still, again, kind of looking at it across the country. Some areas hit more dire than others, assessing that. And the immediate learning that started to rear its head, kind of the immediate term, but then also the longer term, was setting up a greater need for fluidity and flexibility. Certain things that are levers in which we would need to pull, again, as I mentioned, messaging, right? What product or even utility we needed to focus on, the fact that we're open, or we're open with drive-through only, or on order ahead, things of those message points, or in terms of the distribution of how we're communicating, and looking at partnering with various video distributors to say, based on what we've laid out, the ability to maybe take down those investments, reassess our financial balance situation, and lean into something that might have been more fluid, right? So think digital messaging, paid social was a big part of it. Again, almost for utility reasons, based on what consumers were quite literally asking us, even through our own social listening. Are you open? Or when will you open? So basically kind of moving from sort of basic communications to assessing the situation, to essentially satisfy demand that was out there. But then importantly, kind of looking brand by brand, and I'll use Buffalo Wild Wings as a, kind of key example, probably the hardest hit, a year ago, if we all recall, which I'm sure we painfully do, sports all but disappeared for a period of time, right? And so that being a key conduit for Buffalo Wild Wings, coupled with the fact that at the time, most of the business was really geared towards in-restaurant dining, right? So if dining rooms are also closed, it really eclipses the opportunity. So a big pivot for that brand, again, kind of catering to a need, was leaning in towards off-premise delivery, and also leaning into the absence of activities in the case of sports, programs, some of which pre-existed, for example, Wing Tuesday or even Boneless Thursday, today being one of those, is reminding consumers to again, kind of satisfy that demand, or in some cases create the demand to then capture it.
So it's interesting as you talk about Buffalo Wild Wings, because you have a portfolio, and as you were making those decisions, talking about the need for fluidity, flexibility, you're changing messages on the fly. I love that it's very interesting to know that you're listening to your own social channels and helping inform that messaging. How helpful is it, because you have the brands doing different things, to learn quickly and adapt across a portfolio? How does that help you?
Yeah, the short answer is it's tremendously helpful, and we could talk for hours on this. I'll kind of acknowledge that it was helpful in the situation that was a year ago, right? To say, how are we handling the situation for Sonic? Do we need to handle it in parallel with Arby's? Potentially even the ability, or at least setting up the question, if we need to offload inventory because of, let's say, a more compounded business situation for one brand, but let's say, Sonic, which if you could design a brand that's set up to withstand COVID, Sonic is probably a prime example. But my point is this: is the ability to say, if we needed to offload inventory, we could approach it in inventory, meaning media inventory. We could approach it that way. So that's kind of a in the moment way to sort of real time address the situation. But I think largely to your point, Kari, it's looking at even present day to say, if we have let's say a learning agenda, and it's focused on cross-channel reach and how that's driving the return to, quote, normalcy, right? If we're starting to see more traction and foot traffic going to the restaurant, if the learning apparatus that we have in place is set up, let's say, with third-party attribution partner that we're running for that brand, but yet we have, let's say, I'll be honest, a competing third-party attribution partner with another, it allows us to kind of cross-compare, right? And understand the efficacy and the scalability if you will, to say if we fundamentally are, which oftentimes we are, solving for the same thing, it gives us that leverage point, right? And I think importantly, which is really important to me, to be able to have a transparent conversation with either entity in that case, the third party partner, to say, here's what we're seeing versus the other. And if we are to consolidate more of our deployment through one, it's explaining to the other why there's a competitive advantage or disadvantage in either case. But again, there are multiple abilities to learn. But as I think ahead to what we're forecasting for next year's upfront as an example, or just the business state in general, the need for a learning agenda is never going to go away. If anything, I think it's becoming more important, and the ability to cross compare and kind of learn through the portfolio is infinitely important. And that that kind of plays into one of the fundamentals that we set forth with Inspire is this notion of the ability to do more and offer more through the value of a portfolio than what maybe a single brand can get and learn on its own. And so I think through cross learnings, especially through media, is just an example of many, and hopefully how we can pay that out.
Yeah, I think that's just one thing I want to dive in just a little bit on, which is as you're seeing things in the media buying, planning thing specifically, the strategy that you're putting forth, what's an example of something that you can learn from one of the brands that you can then pivot and apply? You mentioned obviously your cross measurement solutions, but in terms of media and like and risk taking, and do you try new things? Like, how does that look as you're doing media buying?
Yeah,
really last year, and then now, how has that changed to segue into 2021?
Yeah, so I'll give you, and again, this is a little bit of a recall of last year, the learnings, and I'll caveat by saying we're not unique to this. I mean, I think we were one of probably all, if not most verticals, looking at sizable investments that were put in place throughout 2020 as part of whether it was an upfront investment or even scatter to a degree, is this notion of fluidity and flexibility, right? And again, I'll just underscore, that's not unique to us, but as a real learning, we're thinking ahead to what it is that we need to do for next year. How do we bring that forward into our terms, and how we're not only thinking about fleshing out the plan, but ultimately activating through it. The other thing that I would emphasize, within that, is the idea of measurement piece, right? So this is where it comes together with what we're doing in terms of collective reach and how we attribute that to primarily in restaurant traffic, inclusive of drive-through, but at the same time, really applying learnings that we gained this year as it relates to the importance of digital sales, inclusive of delivery, either be it first party or third party delivery. So that behavior, how much of that either slowly deprecates or just becomes kind of the normal, right? That people are saying, hey, I'm kind of used to this. I'm still working from home. I may continue to be working from home. And the value of the convenience factor, let's just say, is really important to me. So that becomes a big part of what we're doing, and frankly, part of our ongoing learning agenda. I think that's going to be key. And so, just to kind of recap and simplify, I think the fluidity, and flexibility, but also the ability to hold funds closer in if we need to pivot, I think is going to be key.
And also, as a part of that, again, a little bit more of a deep dive, we talked a little bit about linear versus OLV, and how you navigate that. So as you have flexibility and fluidity, like, how do you think about if you're holding things back, at what point are you, what are the criteria that sort of has you move and lean in this year versus last year was kind of obvious, right? We have to pull because the event isn't happening, et cetera. Like, what kind of things will drive decisions this year? Is it it's specifically the learning agenda and things you want to figure out, and kind of following that potential deprecation curve, or how will you think about that shift back and forth this year?
Yeah. I mean, great question, Kari. And I think it's, it is to a degree the learning agenda. Absolutely. Like many brands, we are probably less reliant on, call it a market mix model assessment from last year, just because of all the noise. But nonetheless, still inferring what we knew to be true. Video is critical to what we do, within the restaurant category, both CDR as well as QSR. But I think it's a matter of, in what form and when and how people are consuming it, right? So the utility of linear television, it's for a number of years, it's been mission critical to what we're doing. And obviously, I'm not saying anything that's also unique to us or proprietary, but as we watch the ratings erosion continue, it really is about, and this is kind of a different fluidity and flexibility. And by this, I mean not just the investment, but rather how are we moving to where the consumption is, so that we are staying top of mind. We're delivering out on what we believe to be key as it relates to a reach metric. And when I say something like that, that too is somewhat unique and bespoke to each of our brands. Some brands, I think we probably have rolled up our sleeves more on the TV reach factor and creating we believe we need to be here to drive X level of awareness, which is then correlated to traffic and transactions. But it's fair to say that model, it broke last year. I would also submit that it right now probably breaks every month, right? So my point is, it's not in a vacuum, and we have to apply, again, a little bit of a recall to say, if most of our transactions or a large offset of our transactions were being driven by traditional TV, what's a fair futures market projection of what we think that's going to be, and how do we pair that up against learning in real time, right? And that's so it's kind of that learning agenda, but putting things out there to say, is it working? Not losing sight of your question to say, how do we pair that with the idea of OTT and let's just call it digital video companions, here to stay for sure. And I think that mix is continuing to evolve and graduate. And if we're really paying out on the idea of audience-centric planning, is again that level of flexibility and fluidity over time, which for us, as we're approaching sometimes each month with a different limited time offer, it's fair to say that audience and who we believe is going to be more receptive to responding to that demand that we're creating against that platform, that can't be static month to month to month, right? So
right.
All that to say, flexibility, fluidity is absolutely key.
So we're coming up on the Q&A that happened so fast. I feel like we just started talking, and I want to make sure that we put it out there that we can start to take questions from the panel. It is going to just be such an interesting year, and it seems like everybody is going to have to just, as you mentioned, it's almost a month-to-month reconfiguration. What kind of, you have an agency, you have all these different touch points. How do you, if something's going month to month, how do you create consistency and reduce swirl, if you will, for everybody? Is there a way that you can do media buying that has it's anchored, but yet, as you say, there's flexibility is key.
Completely fair, right? So I want to be clear that this is not a free for all. It begins with anchoring to an objective and a foundation, and that begins with an investment. But I think what's upon us, which we're doing in partnership with the agency and general direct conversations, is to understand how publishers and partners are also adapting, right, and selling for that matter. So I think as we're approaching it, it's really on us to be planful in our approach, but also to be very clear on what it is that we're solving for, and saying these are the we must do's. And so if we're concise in that, how do we then put that forth to say, this is how we can build a plan with investments tied to it, but investments that have the ability to scale up and scale down relative to those objectives.
That makes perfect sense. So we have a question. This first question is, it feels like every day there is a new app, a new device that marketers need to pay attention to. How do you make sense of that fragmentation? And how do you evaluate these channels and determine where your consumers are and where you need to be?
Yeah.
Great question.
It is a great question, and one that I'll be honest, we grapple with, and not to kind of just sweep it into the learning agenda box, but it could end up there. But I would really kind of come back to what I mentioned, Kari, tied to your last question, which is how are we approaching our plan, and that really comes, what do we think we're solving for? So if there is an app or a publisher or a new solution in general that has a capability, or at least a capability that seems to be drawing a circle around what it is that we're after. We may be dabbling in it now, but we're not seeing critical mass or results that are indicative of a path forward. If said solution seems to maybe get closer to an unlock, then I think that becomes kind of our filter criteria, right? So anyway, it's really tied to an objective first.
Just an additional question from that is, how do you then, for new forms of media as they're coming into the mix, what kind of inputs do you get before they reach that, critical mass? Does that make it to you in your role? Are you having your agency partners test things out? Like, how do you look at new forms of engagement with consumers early on?
I hope this doesn't sound like a generic answer, but I think that the way that we're partnering with our agencies is for them to be an extension of our team. So said differently, it is a combination of them hopefully bringing partners and opportunities to us, but on occasion the other way around too. So it's a joint effort in that sense, but it really centers back to sort of root issue and where do we think we need to be focused.
Another question is, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
How are you currently tracking with which creatives are the most consistent and effective across your brands so that you can cross measure and compare in the business?
So the question was with creatives?
Yes. How are you currently tracking which creatives are the most consistent and effective across the brands?
Yeah. It's a good question. We measure, I'll say this, our greatest proxy to creative measurement is tied to day-to-day performance in terms of sales and transactions. That's the most simplistic, rudimentary answer. There's a longer one which involves creative copy testing polls, which happen as well, but I'll maybe stick to my first answer as the most effective.
And that makes sense. So the question was across brands. Is there anything, especially from the messaging that had to shift last year to that you learned across the brands that was the most effective in terms of driving foot traffic, et cetera, again in 2020, and then as we push into this new?
Yeah, sure. Okay, got it. Yeah. So I think not blending, let's say, creative message that needs to be on brand, but rather the type of message and the manner in which we're doing it. Yes, last year in particular, and actually the year prior, there's a certain term we use for it. I'd rather not say, but rather it's a very quick activation that can be scaled to market quickly through digital channels. It's typically very time bound, meaning that we're inciting customers to take action on it to the restaurants. It's a very, as evidence would support, it's a very efficient way to go to market, scaled nationally. And from that learning, which really began with one brand, we've now applied it to several. So it's a little bit of a playbook that I think is extensible. And that's certainly something that I think we'll continue to look at moving forward. Same would be true with a publisher as it relates to connecting to an audience. I think that's something that we'll certainly keep our antenna up to try to identify down the road as well.
Great answer. We have another question. Have there been any commonalities across the portfolio for tactics to support off-premise versus on-premise? Are there brands that will focus more on one than the other as the world opens back up? I guess
Yeah,
that probably a little bit of who might stay more with delivery.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'll answer it with, and I'll again kind of reference Buffalo, which I said earlier in the session, realizing that some folks may have missed that. The hardest hit brand, right, which was also the most dependent upon in-restaurant dining. I think as we read the situation now, kind of real time, is how do we try to get back to in-restaurant levels that maybe we saw 2 years ago, but at the same time not cannibalize new customers. And I think that's a big factor that we are identifying and solving for. And this I would actually submit is somewhat agnostic to the portfolio, that if we gained new users, and that's, let's say it's knowable based on in-app opt-in, if we gained them last year, because other restaurants may have been closed, or it was just a matter of just kind of general circumstances. But if we've been able to retain them since, that lifetime value, is absolutely key. And then importantly, how are we learning with them, through them, to keep them in the equation? I think is something that's going to be key for us, that we'll continue to evaluate over time.
Did you have to, as the pursuit of the audience to download apps last year obviously exploded, did you have to do specific media buying or advertising that you were promoting that message more than you had been in the past, or was that sort of a kind of an organic growth?
Great question. I mean, the general answer, it was a little bit of both, but I would say organic, just because of necessity. I mean, people were seeking it out. And I think it's also fair to say that, with third-party delivery partners, that too has been somewhat of a conduit, right? Introducing people to brands that subsequently, as they were introduced to, let's say, one of our brands in that environment, that they have since opted to download. So there's a little bit of organic perpetuity as a function of that as well.
Another question is, how important are interactive ad experiences for your brands moving forward? Like using QR codes and media creatives to incentivize app downloads or drive consumer to loyalty programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the importance of it, a little bit tied to what is the objective, is kind of key again to the size of the objective. So I'll just address it this way to say that we're using it, and I think, like everything, continuing to evaluate what part of the mix, the marketing mix, do we want to continue focusing on, which probably varies a little bit brand by brand.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Brian. I can't believe we're at the end of our time already.
Yeah, it was great, Kari. I
super
appreciate
fast. Hi, Alan.
Hey, how you doing, Kari? This is a great conversation. It's really fascinating, Brian, especially because, you guys were sort of front and center of everything that went down over the last 15 months, however long it's been. So it's just really interesting to hear how you dealt with it.